We meet monthly for our SLAP meetings, and tonight is no exception. It's our last meeting for 2020, and none of us will be too disappointed to see the end of 2020, I'd suggest. But look, tonight's a special event, more so than a general meeting. In our discussions at our last meeting, there was concerns about some media predicting temperature increases 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius. We were wondering where that leaves us as a group, what our reaction should be, what we should say, what we can do. We decided to do nothing and sent all committee members away to do a bit of research on the subject, to come back tonight to better understand, better inform us all ourselves, with a likelihood then that we might be in a better position to decide just where SLAP tomorrow should go. In that process, Rob not only did a bit of research, he recruited David Karoly to come along and discuss it with us. So that's the background to tonight's gathering. Understanding the assumption, the modelling is backed by assumptions, and unless we understand all those assumptions, it's very difficult to make heads or tails of modelling. I'm David. We're hoping that you can bring us up to date with the best knowledge as we sit here today, better understanding some of the modelling that was perhaps behind that 3.5 to 4 degree figure, and just to put us into a position where we can at least go to Christmas with some understanding and some plan forward. So, Rob, you might introduce David. You've got. I doubt whether David needs an introduction.
No, I don't think he needs an introduction.
No, I don't think so either. No. If David thinks we've missed anything or wants to bring us up to date with his background, he can. So, Dave, why don't we hand it over to you? We're particularly interested in the best predictions at the moment with what we know. Temperature rises over this century, perhaps. Even the shorter term targets, 250 perhaps. And yeah, in your hands, David.
Okay, well, that wasn't quite what I was expecting or anticipating, because Robert said it was going to be a discussion or a conversation, and I think that it might be more useful. But I will say a few things around what you've described, John, and then I think it would be more useful to have this as an active and, multi-person discussion, yes, rather than me preaching to the converted. Mainly because I've met a number of you. In fact, you've all probably heard me talk in Shepparton already, and I continue to be happy to be involved in these sorts of things. And in fact, I think, Rob, you've got me lined up to come for a Beneath the Wisteria anniversary.
That's correct, David. Yep.
Is it in February? Or
no, it's in April or March, I think. Yeah, March, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyhow, I'll be back again. You can't get rid of me. But so let me give a little bit of an introduction. I've been involved in doing climate change science for a long time. I think that it's an important subject. I am really pleased, as I heard before, that there's groups like your group, SLAP Tomorrow and other groups around that are interested in having ongoing discussions about both the risks of unmitigated climate change on your communities and your environment, your families and your friends, but also that you're willing to take action to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and try to avoid the worst impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and effectively to keep yourself informed about the best science. So, my response today is really to just try to bring you up to speed. And the part that I think was talked about in terms of the 3.5 to 4 degrees was discussions that occurred in a conversation that Rob had recorded with Joel Gergis, and that was mainly about projections of global temperature increases. First of all, relative to pre-industrial, and secondly, with no mitigation action. And that's how you get 3.5 to 4 degrees or much more if there is no action. We already know, even in Australia, people are taking action. Apart from your good selves, there's actually significant action going on in the business sector to reduce emissions. The tricky part, and this is where we start to get onto some of the bad news, and it's 3.5 to 4 degrees is not bad enough. The bad news is that even with the commitments of all countries that honor the Paris Agreement, we are still looking at 2.5 to 3.5 degrees of global warming relative to pre-industrial, not relative to now. We've had 1 degree already, but relative to pre-industrial, we're likely to have about 2.5 to 3.5 degrees global warming. And that's still a very large range, and there's many countries that are not going to meet their Paris commitments. So I'm happy to try to go on further and talk about the uncertainties. There is a big uncertainty range for unmitigated emissions, and there's also a big uncertainty range even if we do meet the Paris commitments. The warming will still be very substantial and there will be major impacts, and the warming in Australia will be larger than the global average warming.
Why is it larger in Australia, David?
Well, Rob, you know this better than I do, but most of the world is not land.
Yeah.
Most of the Earth's surface is ocean. And the ocean warms up less quickly than the land. And that continues to be the case even in a stable no emissions requirement, because most people know that the oceans are wet. And I've said this in talks in Shepparton before, and I hope you haven't forgotten that the oceans still remain wet. That means there's a greater potential for evaporation, and evaporation cools the surface. And even in a stable climate, the oceans, relative to some current state, will warm, but will be less magnitude of warming than the land. And you know that already. I mean, the inland areas relative to the coastal areas, the inland areas will warm up faster.
So why are the Arctic areas getting hotter, David?
Well, there's something else that's happening over the Arctic, and it's not true in Antarctica, but certainly the Arctic is losing ice over the oceans and snow cover over land. And so that means that the reflective surface, the snow and ice, is disappearing, and that accelerates the warming.
Yeah.
Tom, can I just break in there?
John. Yeah.
We have a new face on board, Zara Haydar-Big. She's one of our candidates for the last council elections, David, and it's the first time she's been able to join with us. Welcome to SLAP tomorrow, and please feel free to ask any questions of any of us as we go through. We're very informal. So welcome, Zara.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Zara.
That's good. David, the Paris Agreement and what we're looking at there with countries, even if they achieve their Paris targets, you were saying 2.5 to 3.5.
That's correct. So look, the Paris target was seeking to limit global warming at what at the time was considered to be a safe level, less than 2 degrees, with an aspirational goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. It was agreed in 2015, and leading up to 2015, actually global emissions had started to slow down in their rate of increase. Unfortunately, the most recent science would indicate that, first of all, emissions had accelerated in their growth in the period from 2015 to 2019. And secondly, that not only had the globe continued to warm, but it was now virtually impossible to limit global warming to under 1.5 degrees, because the rate of warming every decade had been of the order of 2 to 3/10 of a degree per decade. And it's not going to slow down in the 2030s unless some massive, whatever, series of volcanic eruptions puts enough dust out to cool the climate system. But in practice, we're locked into ongoing warming, and the rate of warming over the last decade is of the order of 3/10 of a degree. So we're already at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We'll be at around 1.5 degrees sometime above pre-industrial, sometime in the 2030s. And you'll all, with, I guess, good luck, still alive in the 2030s, to experience global warming of 1.5 degrees. Now, that's not something you want to look forward to, but it's something that we can't do very much about.
David, in all of this, tipping points can't be accounted for in modelling and predictions?
Look, that's not quite the case. There are a number of tipping points that are to some extent taken into account in the climate modelling. So there are what are called Earth system models that take into account, for instance, vegetation loss, the drying out of the Amazon rainforest or the Indonesian rainforest, or even the Australian forested areas, the burning of those, and then the release of carbon dioxide, that are taken into account in some models, but those actually then just show continued warming and accelerated warming. So there are some even worse tipping points or feedbacks, like the melting of permafrost in the Arctic areas, which could even accelerate the warming even further. And you're right, John, that is not taken into account in these simulations.
So a question from Derek, David. You referred to the pre-industrial baseline. Is that the same baseline that IPCC are using?
Yes, it is. And yeah. It's not really a pre-industrial baseline. It's a period for which there's adequate data sets with reasonable global coverage. And it's used in the IPCC as the 1850 to 1900 period, mainly because there's just enough data coverage then to come up with a ocean average and land average temperature. There is likely a slight warming from 1700 to 1800, and then 1800 to 1900, but not very much. And it's hard to estimate because the only geographical locations that had quite good coverage then are in Europe. There certainly wasn't good coverage in the Southern Hemisphere. In many regions, there wasn't good coverage over the oceans, and there wasn't good coverage in the Americas. So, you know, the global data sets are really only available from about 1850 onwards. And even then they had substantial data gaps.
Simon had a question, I think, David.
David, nice to see you. And I'm interested in the decarbonisation pathway, and particularly about the speed. So Tim Flannery recently said something like, we need to see an 8% reduction. I'm not sure he's referring to net zero or what I consider real zero towards real zero emissions. I also know Kevin Anderson in the UK has been talked about 10 to 15% per annum. What's your take on, maybe just take Australia, because we have more control over what we do in Australia. What's your understanding of the sort of decarbonisation pathway rate that we need to be hitting?
Are you talking about from now to net zero?
From now to net zero.
In
fact, I would actually like to see, because I think net zero is a real issue we probably should discuss as well, about whether that's a reasonable thing to do. Or maybe just talk about that as well, because I have real issues with the concept of net zero as loading our children with a particularly demanding technological challenge that we have yet to figure out how to rise to if we have to take emissions out of the atmosphere that we're currently pumping in.
Well, okay, so let me talk about what I think net zero means. And there are some, how would I say, emission sectors for which it is relatively easy, including electricity generation and transport, whereas it's relatively easy to go to absolute zero emissions in both of those sectors now. You know, not quite tomorrow. It'll take a little bit longer than that to get enough electric vehicles manufactured and to get enough solar panels and wind turbines in Australia. But you could certainly go to absolute zero emissions within 5 years in Australia. Just not with any of the current state or federal governments, because the social transition would be disastrous for doing it that rapidly. But with a 10-year plan and a transition plan, it would be easy between 2020 and 2030 for Australia to go to zero in those sectors. But there are other sectors, particularly to do with construction, but also in the food sector. And most of us would still recognize that a population and society in Australia in which no one ate food would have a long lifetime. In fact, I would guess that if no one in Australia ate food, the lifetime would be 2 weeks.
A reasonable assumption. We'll accept that one.
However, the other part of that message is that currently, with all existing technologies, we cannot produce food without some emissions at the quantities needed to either provide food for the Australian population. And so there is some fertilizer use, there's some soil loss of carbon. There are ways to offset it to some part. Even if you go completely vegetarian, there is various sorts of both fertilizer use and other use. And you don't have to use fertilizer, you can just use natural waste and things like that as part of fertilizers. But even then, there will still be some emissions associated with agriculture, and it's just soil carbon loss. You can offset that with vegetation, but it is extremely difficult to go to absolute zero emissions in food production. Now, you can offset it. You can plant trees. You can do other things like that. All of those are really possible. But net zero, I think, is a reasonable target. I would argue that the most reasonable time to think about that is sooner than 2050, and that now, nearly 10 years ago, the Climate Change Authority said that Australia should be aiming at net zero emissions between 2037 and 2040. Because of the high emissions in Australia and what was needed in terms of a carbon budget approach. And the carbon budget approach has demonstrated that Australia willfully emitted fossil fuel related emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for the last 10 years and continues to do so without any care for the climate change impact on Australia. So how you achieve that? Well, you've got to go from now, the Minister for no emission reductions, in the sense that he doesn't care about emission reductions, the Minister for Emission Reductions, said and congratulated Australia on having reached a grand total of 5% below 2000 emissions in June of this year, primarily associated with the COVID restrictions.
Yep.
But they're likely to rebound in the next few months and certainly by June of next year. So that means we're basically at 2000 level emissions. We want to go to zero in 20 years. Well, to go from 100% to zero in 20 years means you've got to reduce by more than 5% per year every year.
Yep.
For 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's 5% or whether it's 8% depends upon whether you're doing 8% compounding or an absolute amount. But it's a very big change, in the emission reductions in Australia for the last 12 months associated with the COVID restrictions is, I think, around 3 to 4%.
David, have you got any observations about what we're likely to see here in Shepparton?
What you're likely to see, it's going to be hotter.
How much hotter? You prepared to make any comment about that?
Oh, which day of the week are you talking about?
Well, just generally for a start, the temperature's obviously going to go up, but how much do you think?
Look, I don't think you're going to hit 50 Celsius in Shepparton this decade.
It's coming now.
Sorry?
That's reassuring, David. 50 degrees Celsius would certainly stir up the fruit industry here in the Golden Valley for a start.
Yeah, absolutely. But you are aware that on Black Saturday in 2009, I mean, you were below 50 by a long way, but you didn't have to get too far away when, you know, there were temperatures north of the divide, a bit further west of you guys, where it got, you know, into the high 40s.
Yep. No, David, I wouldn't be quite as confident as you that we don't see 50 before the turn of the century. I believe we will.
No, I said decade.
Decade.
Oh, decade. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I said decade. Did I say decade?
Oh, you said decade.
Everyone's nodding except Pettigrew. Yeah, no.
No, I was saying decade, John. So wait a sec. This is only another degree or so above what. Yeah. And some of those temperatures. That's what I'm talking about. 2009. So you know we're talking about now 20 years from 2009.
Yeah.
And so look, I think you'll be okay. But boy, 50 degrees before 2030. A lot of people would be, as well as the fruit growers, would be pretty cactus. But unless, look, the grape growers will be fine because they could just use them sultanas and raisins straight off the vines. And that's exactly what happened in 2009.
Yeah.
The grapes were becoming raisins and sultanas, well, if you pick the right grapes, in 1 or 2 days.
So what will happen with water, David? Will we see more of it or less of it, or what will happen there?
So the answer is yes and yes.
Yes and yes, we'll see more and less.
Yeah, some days it'll be really wet and you'll get more intense rainfall and thunderstorms and downpours. And on other days, like has happened, you'll get extended dry periods and it'll be hotter. So, I mean, the forecast for this summer is it's not actually going to be that hot. But you've already had some pretty hot short periods in November of reasonably hot weather, which has been, short spells. But look, the long-term, if you like, view, Rob, is that extreme short period rainfall is likely to get more intense, partly because the climate system is warming, and if you get moisture down from the tropics, it can contain very moist air, particularly if it's a little bit warmer or a big bit warmer. And then secondly, the cool season rainfall affecting much of Victoria is likely to decline. And that means both for irrigation and agriculture, keeping the dams well stocked, keeping the irrigation systems going is going to become more difficult.
I sat through I sat through a webinar of yours just recently, I think it was, about flash droughts. Can you talk about those, David?
Well, I don't think it was mine, but it was certainly, I was sitting through it as well. It was quite,
yeah.
it was the research centre that I'm involved in. And flash droughts are really rapid, short periods, or rapid drying out associated with short periods of no rainfall and high temperatures. And they're relatively well known in, you know, in agricultural areas. It's a new jargony term which has attracted attention. It's been used a lot in the United States because, in particular, for rainy climate zones where they've grown maize or corn, not through irrigation, but just straight in the ground, if it gets dry, and because they have quite hot periods, the year-to-year variability can mean that, and month-to-month variability, that you can end up with, you know, periods even of the order of a month where you have much, much below normal rainfall. And if it's in spring and summer, you'll often have high temperatures, and then you can end up with very rapid impacts on agricultural systems. Soil moisture dries out, and you end up with major agricultural impacts on non-irrigated crops. And in Australia, big risks of grass fire danger. It takes longer than a month for most forested areas to dry out completely, but scrub and particularly grass fires can occur with just, you know, a dry period of a month or even a little bit longer in the summer or in the spring. And in some sense, that's what's been happening in northern New South Wales and Queensland again, where they've been getting 45 degrees. It hasn't been raining. Wet season hasn't started in southern Queensland yet, and they're getting extreme temperatures, and they will certainly be getting an enormous amount of drying in that region.
Val had a question, I think, David.
Go ahead.
You're muted, Val. It's coming, David.
Post Christmas.
You're on mute, Val.
Yeah, I've got it. Sorry, David.
That's okay. Go ahead.
It was interesting to look at the temperatures when we were having the 39, the 40, 43 we had on Saturday. But looking at Sydney the next 2 days, they were 41 on the west, but the city was 41, 40, and the airport 42. That's odd because normally the coastal is like degrees cooler than west. There was always a city temperature and a western temperature. And that just struck me as being really odd. And they actually got it hotter than we did. And we cooled down on Sunday and Monday, and they didn't actually. They were still very hot at night and all the day, even on the coast.
So look, the weekend situation and then this heat wave that's moved to the north and west, we didn't get as strong northerly winds as what was experienced a bit further north in southern New South Wales, and then that whole system. I mean, the hot air was coming from the inland, more central Australian region, and that air still continued to, first of all, descend, but also with northerlies and westerlies penetrate into, the far eastern parts of New South Wales, across the Blue Mountains into the Sydney region. I can't tell you exactly why it wasn't as hot in the sort of Penrith, western suburbs areas as the things like the airport and things like that. It was interesting, though, that there were some areas that got to 45 degrees in one part of the western suburbs and another part that wasn't. I don't fully understand what was happening either with the cloud cover or the weather. The normal pattern is exactly as you described, where the sea breeze penetrates a little bit, keeps Sydney Observatory Point a little bit cooler, keeps the airport a little bit cooler. But sometimes when the westerly winds are strong enough, it'll push the sea breeze out to over the ocean, and you'll end up with the temperatures similar in the western suburbs to all the way into the Sydney city centre. And that's essentially what appears to have happened. But I can't tell you much more than that, except you wouldn't want to be putting a housing development in the suburbs of the western suburbs of Sydney in much the same way as you wouldn't want to be putting a housing development into, you know, Laverton or western suburbs of Melbourne. The city centre in Melbourne was 46 on Black Saturday, was 48.5 at Avalon and outside Melbourne on that day. And it's not that far away, but it was just more exposed to the heat coming in. And you know, I don't know how hot it was in Mildura and on that day, but I believe it was of the order of 48.5 to 49 degrees.
David, framing our conversation in our local community here, we're always looking for opportunities to best demonstrate the issue coming forward. Recently, we've had outside sporting events cancelled, tennis last 2 weeks in a row. With the sort of figures that temperatures we're looking at, it's going to make almost summer sports almost dead in the water up here in some areas. Are there other areas of conversations that you think we could be having within our community that demonstrates areas like that, or anything else you've come across?
Look, I mean, my experience in the Shepparton area is you've got such a diverse range of, if you like, industries in terms of the fruit, some irrigated, some, you know, sort of grazing, cropping, water resources, all of those sorts of things. There are many different aspects, as well as the sort of community health that are going to be very important. I mean, some of the most important ones, and some of the ones that have obviously been demonstrated over the last decade, are the ongoing wintertime drying and what that means for changes in farming systems, the increases in temperature extremes, again, that impacts farming systems, but it also impacts human health in terms of increased frequency of bushfires, but absolutely it impacts, you know, summer sport. And I was surprised. I wasn't aware that the temperatures, John, were you saying that the temperatures were so hot on the weekends that they couldn't have summer sport in these recent weekends?
Yes, a lot of sports have temperature levels that they don't play in. It's partly to do with the rising temperatures. It's also public risk. Public risk is probably more acute now than it was in the past as well. But no, certainly tennis is one of those. Cricket under some circumstances, but
yeah,
outdoor sport, it's hard.
Yeah, so it would have been interesting. You're probably right that there are, how would I say, legal aspects that are restricting things, because you know, 1939 was a very hot year as well, and it set a number of temperature records, which Andrew Bolt is quite happy to talk about frequently as an indication that there hasn't been any climate change in Victoria. But you know, there were periods then when there were temperatures above 40 Celsius in some parts of, well, a number of parts of Victoria. But, you know, the frequency of those days above 40 Celsius, particularly in, you know, not Melbourne now, but inland Victoria, yeah, plenty of days above 40 Celsius. And yes, the frequency of those occurrences I haven't done the analysis for Mildura, but we were doing it fairly recently for not a Victorian place, but Alice Springs, and the frequency of days above 40 in Alice Springs has skyrocketed. Even though Alice Springs, when you look at the elevation, is actually relatively higher in some cases as well. So yeah, there's a number of cases. The same in Canberra. I mean, Canberra's, whatever it is, over 1,000 meters above sea level, but it was just skyrocketing in number of days above 40 Celsius. So many of these inland areas, dramatic increases in summertime temperature extremes. And worst part is that many of the projections I decided I wasn't going to show any graphs, but what we see is that when we look at the summertime maximum temperatures relative to the projections for much of southeastern Australia, we are seeing the observed temperatures tracking at the worst case of hotter maximum temperatures and faster wintertime drying compared with the climate model projections across all of the climate models. So we're sitting at, if you want to look at the future, want to look at sort of, well, what climate should you be looking at for 2030? Well, when you see a graph that shows a range of temperatures or a range of rainfall for Shepparton or for much of southeastern Australia, take the one with the largest temperature increases and the most amount of drying. And that's what we've been seeing for the last 30 years, tracking at the hottest and driest scenario. Go ahead.
Simon's got a question.
David, all this is sort of, I think a lot of us are sort of aware that these trends, and obviously mitigation is a critical one, but we're going to have to adapt as well. So can you talk about the implications? I'm thinking of these super hot temperatures. Maybe we can reinforce our homes and our civic, systems through the big heat waves with air conditioning and various other safe spaces and so forth. It's very hard to do that for agricultural land, very hard to do it for animal agriculture unless you house them all. Expensive, and there's animal welfare issues for that as well. But also just for the ecological systems themselves. What's your thoughts about how we should be thinking, particularly in the really exposed communities?
That's a really, really good question. And I haven't thought as much and don't have the experience to think as much about adaptation. The best guidance often is to try to plan for these sorts of temperature extremes in terms of the ability of the systems, in this being either cropping or animal, to cope with the temperature extremes. Obviously, one way to provide more resilient farming is actually to have more trees to provide shade for the animals, whether it's cattle or sheep or kangaroos or emus, to provide more trees, hopefully, to use that to then get paid for the carbon that you're sequestering in the trees, because there'll be a carbon price at some stage in the future that you can use that to farm trees as well and get a return on that. I think that we might have to wait for a slightly different government to implement that return on that investment. The tricky part is we're going to need to think a lot about water resources and what is available in terms of the reductions in wintertime rainfall with the occasional heavy downpours in spring and summer. And that requires a slightly different approach and thinking in terms of coping with capturing water when it pours, trying to reduce the erosion that might occur or cause, and then how to make use of or to save that water before it just runs away into flooding and things like that. But look, there are a range of adaptation measures, but I'm not the best person to talk to about that.
David, Derek Colton, we've seen a very catastrophic fire season, 2019-20, and from what you say, that's probably at a temperature increase of about 1.1. If we're heading for 2 degrees plus, what's the fire season going to look like under those sort of conditions, and will areas start to become uninhabitable?
So the quick answer to that is that there are likely to be parts of central and northern Australia for which, you know, if you add 4 degrees Celsius to the temperatures that were experienced on Black Saturday in Victoria in 2009, or in 2019, 2020 in parts of New South Wales or Canberra or southern Queensland, yeah, it's going to be uninhabitable. The most recent climate change assessment put out by the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO around the state of the climate, when you look at the future climate projections, the sorts of monthly temperatures that were experienced in January of 2019 across much of southern and eastern Australia they're still hot, but they become well within the normal range of temperatures, not an unprecedented extreme, by about the late 2030s. So with 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming, you get that as part of the normal range of temperatures associated with year-to-year variability. It's not an unprecedented extreme. It doesn't become normal. It's not the average, but it certainly becomes part of the normal year-to-year variability. And that unfortunately means that whereas 2019 January was unprecedented, it becomes well within the range of normal year-to-year variability. And that means that those sorts of fires across much of southern and eastern Australia become much more frequent. And then the really hot years become the new unprecedented cases, and it's disastrous. But the good news is, if we had the right sorts of motivated people, like all of you, we could do something about it. But that requires, and Victoria is actively moving, has set a zero emissions reduction target for 2050, has been lobbying the federal government, has lots of community support for climate change action. There's been an upper house in Victoria Legislative Council report on supporting community action on addressing climate change. So look, there are lots of really good things happening. The schools are trying to the school children in the School Strike for Climate are trying to persuade lots of groups that this is an urgent action and we need to do a lot more. And all I can say is, one of the reasons that I get involved with these sorts of conversations is to try to encourage you that the sorts of things you're thinking about are really important. The sorts of actions that you're talking about continue to be really important, and your objectives of trying to persuade other people that what you're doing is really important, I congratulate you on, because it requires multiple voices, and particularly people from regional areas who are seeing the impacts and recognizing that action is needed. That's what makes me confident that Australia can address the changes pretty quickly.
David, we've had some success in bringing about the local government in the area, Greater Shepparton City Council, with the climate emergency declaration last year. It's areas like that that we're chipping away at here, despite being in one of the safest national seats in the country and having little comfort from that angle. I believe local government, state government, this is the way to pressure any federal government, and it's slow, it's painstaking, but we have little alternative but to chip away at that. We could, in practical ways, we're being into solar energy here in many forms for decades, almost decades now, and we're doing that, but politically we find it frustrating. I find it frustrating. I can't speak for everyone else on
Yeah,
here.
I'm frustrated too.
Rob's frustrated. There you go. But no, I think we need to get that message. You're in the political scene much closer than we are, David. Oh, I think you are.
I'm not allowed. So, John, I'm not allowed to be public on a whole bunch of these things now because I'm employed by CSIRO, and Rob and I have had a few conversations about this because the public comment policy in CSIRO doesn't allow me to speak out to criticise the government. No. And anytime I mention that, I get a slap over the wrist. Oh. What I have learned, though, is that I can talk about what all countries in the world need to do in terms of addressing the Paris Agreement, and that all countries in the world need to strengthen their actions in terms of emission reductions. And I don't get criticised for that because the Australian government thinks it's not a country in the world on which we live.
Simon,
oh, no, it's just more a comment, really. I think I agree, David, you're in an invidious position from that perspective. But my reading of the political scene is that this whole resistance to fast action on climate is really vulnerable and fragile, and it's not going to last. It simply cannot last. Politically, it's impossible, and particularly with the Biden and Kerry, announcement in the US is an enormous step forward. Australia is now isolated. We already see the Prime Minister. I'm sure you all know this, but you see the changing in tone of the Prime Minister's language around this. And I know from social transformation sort of theory that this can happen really fast. This sudden shift from this resistance to suddenly the political system gets it. Majority of Australians already get this, and we're dealing with a few stragglers. So I think this whole sort of resistance will collapse very soon. I mean, it has to, but I don't know how long they can hold out, to be honest. Yeah. So that's my perspective on it. So while it's so frustrating, I think there is real hope that this can't last.
Yep. So look, I completely agree with you, Simon, but there are a couple of, if you like, comments that I feel I need to make. I can understand that view from everyone here on the call, but there are communities that have been dependent upon fossil fuel related energy and jobs and mining, for which there's a really important social and industrial transformation that needs to take place simultaneously with the, if you like, transitions in the electricity sector, to make sure that the communities are brought along, so that in Queensland or in the Latrobe Valley or in basically Newcastle and the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, that all of those regions that have been so dependent upon mining and things like that, they will get multiple benefits from local energy sources, from wind turbines and solar panels, there will be more jobs, there will be a healthier environment with less pollution. So multiple benefits, and they will look back on this transformation in those regions and suddenly work out, well, why didn't we change years ago? Because now we can hang our sheets outside and they don't get black from the soot.
Yeah.
Not to mention their lungs, David. No.
That's correct. Absolutely. But the sheets are more important.
No, I absolutely agree. That social transformation, economic transformation, and having a story. And I think this is where some of the political actors have really failed to provide an alternative vision. Now, Ross Garnell is trying to do that. There's a bunch of people, but we really need at grass level. And I'm working with some organizations that do some of this stuff that are actually thinking, what does it mean for people on the ground, and how do you enable this economic transformation? But it needs investment from government. But what a time when this massive, if we weren't putting it into gas, what a massive opportunity to invest large amounts of capital in new programs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I completely agree with you. And yes, it's both the communication around it, but the really interesting thing that there are certainly stages where the Labor Party is got almost as much investment in the fossil fuel and mining industry as the Liberal National Party, and there are certainly parts of the Labor Party that, how would I say, aren't that different in their conservative or their unwillingness to recognise the sorts of transformations that are needed, and they've, how would I say, they haven't had the gumption, the willingness to go back and refight those brawls that took place because they're risk averse.
Yeah.
David, Val's either waving to me or she has a question.
Basically, when I go on lots of webinars and Zoom meetings now, there's an awful lot of people who actually work in the mining and especially the coal, especially Newcastle, that are desperate for some leadership because they don't want to be working in an area where everybody despises them and they know it's wrong, and they want a clean future for their kids. And they are so passionate, and it's so sad because they're not being, and there's lots of them. It's just so jolly sad.
Look, I mean, I haven't been on those webinars with those groups, but I completely understand what you're saying, Val. There are community groups that are trying to build that, but there's also still a range of businesses and companies, often with, city-based investors that are wanting to continue to make money out of those resources rather than, if you like, changing to a new sector, a new source of money. So it's a difficult thing, but yes, I think Simon's right. There is this transformation has started, and it's seizing the opportunity.
Greg Barnes had a question.
Greg has a question.
Yeah.
Or a comment.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. John started off with assumptions and modelling. I just wondered if any further modelling is done with the ocean currents. You've heard of the story about the Gulf of Mexico current that goes up to Europe and keeps it warmer, and that can well stop. What are the ramifications of all that, and how real is it that it could happen? What percentage, is it just a slight thing, or is it a fair chance that such a thing could happen, that once that current stops, other currents must stop elsewhere? Thank you.
Look, that's an interesting question, and there's a simple answer and a more difficult or longer answer. So the first thing is, you might remember a movie that came out. It was actually shown on TV, I think, sometime in the middle of the COVID lockdown, because my wife and I watched it again. I think it was called The Day After Tomorrow. Have I picked the right movie?
I don't know. You sounds right. Sounds right.
It's an ice age starts sort of within 2 days. The only problem with that movie is it's physically and climatically impossible. That's all right. It made a Hollywood movie and someone made some money out of it. There are some observed slowdowns in the Gulf Stream, the current that goes up the far eastern side of the United States. But first thing is that there are two parts to that current. The first part is that the overturning circulation in the Atlantic Ocean, which is a major part of that, is driven by cold, salty water being formed in the Arctic region, and that it has got a little bit warmer, but there is still ice formation every winter time. The current is not going to close down, and if it does close down so that the warm water is not pumped as far north, then it will cool down really quickly. The salty water and the cold water will rapidly return, and it'll rebuild itself if there was something. So bottom line is that's a self-correcting system, and it might slow down, but it's not going to rapidly cool down the Gulf Stream. It's not going to lead to a rapid freezing of Europe. And we know that in all the climate model simulations, they do represent that part of the system very well. They show that the reduction in warming in Western Europe and the UK associated with that slowdown in the Gulf Stream actually moderates the rate of warming in England and Western Europe. So what is found is that actually that's a good thing, apart from the fisheries and things like that, but anything that reduces the rate of warming is actually a pretty good thing. And if you go across a latitude circle from, and let me get it right, essentially Newfoundland to the United Kingdom, you find out that the UK is much warmer than Newfoundland, but that they more equilibrate when the Gulf Stream slows down a bit. But it doesn't become, you don't end up with an ice age in the United Kingdom, just slightly moderated warming. Now that's the good news story, and you don't need to believe every movie you watch.
Other questions? Yes, Jeff Lodge.
David, wondering if we can go back to the discussion that we started with, and that was Rob was seeking clarification on what numbers he should be publishing. I'm wondering if you can revisit that and share with us your insights about the projections for 2050 and even 2100. What are we looking at based on the best science of today, assuming that people meet the Paris agreements, and then give us a scenario of what you think the likelihood of meeting the Paris agreements, and if we don't, what impact does that have on the figures?
Yeah.
Because the challenge we've got is there's a complacency that we're doing our bit. That's what I hear in the media. My understanding is we're not doing our bit, and our bit wasn't enough anyway, and that we're not going to meet the targets, and the figures are going to exceed the projections. Can you give us some numbers? It's not only for Rob, but for all of us to use.
Because I don't have a table in front of me to answer those for 2050 or 2100 or something like that, I can't give you all those numbers. I mean, I know exactly what you're asking me. So the simple numbers are that for the what's called the rapid emission reduction target, which sort of meets the Paris, that the warming would stabilize around about 2050 at roughly 2 degrees above pre-industrial and remain roughly stable like that, which is 1 degree more than at present from about 2050 through to 2100. But there's an uncertainty range, and there is still a risk for that there's still of the order of a 20 to 25% chance of exceeding 2 degrees in that scenario. Now, it's also important to understand that meeting that scenario and what's required requires effectively net zero emissions sometime around 2050 or sooner, possibly 2040, globally. Not just in Australia, globally. Now, that requires China and Indonesia and India to also have net zero emissions by that time. China's just said it's going to take that target, but India hasn't taken it, neither has Indonesia. Brazil, I think, wants to increase its emissions. So, look, there are the hopes of meeting that commitment and limiting global warming to under 2 degrees is going to require very, very strong action. And Australia's fair share, as we talked about much earlier, would be, probably net zero by 2040. Now, that's if we all do everything, all countries like. If everyone honours their Paris commitments, as I said before, it's going to be 2.5 to 3 degrees of global warming, much the same as I said in around 2050, possibly a little bit more. But it will, rather than the warming getting to 2050 and then flattening off, it will just continue to go on up to 3.5 degrees or so by 2100. So 2050 levels are going to be much the same, but the warming will continue. And that's if we all meet our Paris commitments and the other commitments already, 2.5 to 3.5 degrees. And what about if some of these feedbacks that we talked about or tipping points occur, or we don't even meet our current Paris targets? Well, it's back to the 3.5 to 4 degrees or substantially more. So I can provide you with some numbers around some of those different scenarios for 2050, 2070, and 2100. But bottom line is 1.5 degree, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is essentially impossible now without, nuclear winter or massive volcanic eruptions or the planet getting hit by an asteroid. And all of those are likely to be much worse than 1.5 degrees of global warming. We're going to shoot through 1.5 degrees, and sometime around 2050 or so, we'll get pretty close to 2 degrees. If we've limited emissions sufficiently, we might stay below 2 degrees, or we'll be around 2 degrees for about the next 50 years if we've met zero net emissions by that timescale globally. Otherwise, it'll continue going on. Or if we haven't met our emission reductions, we'll warm even more. Does that give you enough of round numbers? I'll send Rob an email message, or Rob and John an email message, and happy for you to share those numbers, but I won't be able to send them to you for a few days just because I'll have to quickly check on the numbers that I've got. And I'll be doing some global numbers, but I can probably also provide some Australian numbers as well.
It's suggested that if we go to renewable energy tomorrow, the temperatures will still rise because there'll be no particulates in the air. Is that correct?
And in fact, the warming will accelerate.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So there's a couple of different things. Firstly, we know that there's enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to cause substantial further warming, even with the aerosols staying around. And there's likely locked into about the order of 0.5 degree of warming due to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already, and potentially another 0.5 degree if we get rid of all the aerosols. But at the same time as getting rid of the aerosols, if we also phase out, animal agriculture and things like that, methane disappears fairly quickly. So if we stop using natural gas and phase out all the methane emissions and stuff, there's less greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. But it's a really complicated answer. But the bottom line to your question, Robert, is absolutely, if we were to phase out fossil fuel emissions rapidly, one of the reasons why the low emission scenario in 2050 and the high emission scenario in 2050 isn't because they've got the same carbon dioxide concentrations. It's the low emission scenarios has got much cleaner air and it's got lower carbon dioxide concentrations. So the warming is roughly the same. The aerosols have disappeared, and in the high emission scenarios, the aerosols haven't disappeared because we're still burning fossil fuels and we've still got industrial activity, and those aerosols are offsetting some of the warming. They're reflecting some sunlight back out to space.
David, I think we'll try and wind this up in about 5 minutes.
That's good, because I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, no. Zara's been quiet. I think we may have almost overwhelmed Zara with all our talk, but Zara has to leave in a couple of minutes and wondered if there was any questions any of us had of her. And the reactions of your communities is certainly an interest to us, Zara, whether you've got time to discuss it now or we could do it at our next meeting if you like. But
it's okay. Yes, I'm happy to talk now. Hopefully within few minutes we can wrap it up, as you said.
It's just a matter of your community's approach to the issue. Do they understand? Do you think they understand the issues, or can we help, or your views?
Sure. Yes. It is actually a little bit uncertain information, especially for cold community, for new arrivals. It will be great if you could have some sort of education programs running for the new arrivals, especially. As you can see, we have a big multicultural communities from many countries living in Greater Shepparton. And we also, it will be great if we could focus on them on the side of the jobs we are doing, and give them sort of education and encourage, especially the multicultural community women and girls, to come along and take a part and participate in somehow whatever they can.
I think you've provided us with an idea of a program for next year.
I agree, John. That's right.
So look, I look forward to catching up with you again, even if we meet for a coffee somewhere and to discuss some of the opportunities. But you'd be most welcome to join us again on SLAP tomorrow if you have time.
Sure. Yes. No worries. I think Robert or Derek has my email address. They have my email address. Anytime, just send me email. I will be happy to join in when I have the time. And nice to see you, everyone, tonight, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah, can I ask you a question? I heard the introduction of you to everyone in the group from John, but I missed one part. I think John said that you were a candidate for election to the Greater Shepparton Council. Did you get elected, or you were just standing as a candidate?
I actually did not get in this time. It was my first time, but it is a great experience. Sorry, and I'm looking forward to it for future upcoming elections.
Yeah, because I actually gave a presentation to the Greater Shepparton Council prior to the climate emergency vote to give a briefing with my good friend Graham Anderson from DPI in Melbourne. And we talked about both the climate change risks as well as the agricultural risks. And I believe that was well received. John, you were in the audience, were you?
No, I'm smiling because we softened the councillors up with students and a team lobbed in to brief council, and you were the next group to come through, I think, and we all contributed, David. It must have worked.
Yes, I think so, and I'm sure they would have made the same decision if our internet connection had failed and it was just you and the school kids, because in practice, the value of the contribution is much greater from locals, because you're the people who vote, than it is from the so-called remote city-based experts who are valueless in terms of their voting power in the Shepparton Council elections. So I'm sure, John, it was you and the students that were much more important than me and Graham Anderson.
I'd reduce it even more than that to the students. I really think the student we had with us that day carried the argument.
Yep.
Good.
Not, it hasn't even got a vote on for council, but I'm convinced that she carried the day for us. Any
Just got a
final
question.
questions or
Just got a
comments?
question.
Okay.
And Rob, that in lies one of the problems. When people talk about climate change, there's a perception that the change has occurred instead of an acknowledgement that it's just begun.
Mm.
That is a concern I have, and I hear that so often in the public arena. And that's why the numbers that David has touched on today are important in putting things in context.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Jeff, there's another comment as well that some people have heard about climate change a lot, but hear about it happening in the future and only in the future, not that it's started, it's already happening and it's just going to be a lot more in the future. So I'll provide a few numbers about how much the warming's has been already. But if you want some latest information, have a look at the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO's State of the Climate report, which is easily you can find it on any internet server. It's just State of the Climate 2020. It's got a 2-minute summary video that has all the information. You don't even need to read anything. It's got a video there. It's readily available, has all the numbers on what's happened already, and he's now saying much, much more confidently information about both temperature changes, rainfall changes, everything I talked about, and not so much about projections into the future. The Bureau's conservative about that, but there is quite a lot of information about the projections, and again, information about what's happened in terms of reductions in rainfall and increases in temperature, tracking at the hottest, driest.
David, are you heading for retirement?
Yeah,
You are.
I am.
Hang on, he hasn't got over the problem yet. He can't retire yet.
Yeah, I'm going to retire, and I'm going to transition to retirement and part-time, how would I say, expert,
Okay.
and shift back to an honorary role at the University of Melbourne, so that I will be more flexibility in terms of what I can say publicly. And I'm going to be gun for hire in terms of expert witness in court cases in Australia on climate change, because I will be able to say, and I'm one of the few people in Australia who's been involved in court cases.
I think we could sign you up as a SLAP member. You spend that much time with us anyway. Thanks, David.
It's only once every 2 or 3 years, but look, yes, I look forward to coming up, and the next time will be beneath the wisteria, sometime in March,
Yeah.
and I vaguely remember the 20th of March.
I've got it on the wall somewhere, but I can't see it. So I think it's the 20th, something like that. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you, thank you,
And,
thank you.
There's messages come through, one from Simon saying that he still has his New Zealand passport. He's convinced that New Zealand's going to be more livable than Australia, but I'm not too sure. Not too sure, but look, thanks everyone. Have a safe festive season, and SLAP tomorrow will be back in action next year.